My relatives were clearly not themselves. Their faces were flushed from drinking alcohol, and their voices, like a bolt from the blue, pierced the atmosphere of the wedding celebration. People around us were whispering, casting sidelong glances at us, but it seemed that my relatives didn't care at all about these condemning glances and whispers behind our backs. They were not bothered by the place or the time, and they continued to shout at me, as if they had forgotten that it was my wedding day. They did not slow down and did not think about their words, but continued to throw accusations and demands. "Well, I think it's too late to change anything, because you're already married," one of them said with a bitter smile. "But if you want to be a part of our family, you'll have to prove that you have money. You have to show that you are able to provide not only for yourself, but also for us." Their voices sounded louder and more demanding. "You've heard what your father says," they continued. "Now don't forget to pay us $1,000 a month as a bonus." It was a new, sudden, and completely ridiculous request that made me shudder inwardly. I was stunned. Their words echoed in my head, and I couldn't believe that this was all happening at my wedding reception. It seemed to me that the ground was slipping away from under my feet. I stood speechless and stared at them in amazement. My face was undoubtedly pale from shock, and my thoughts began to rush chaotically in search of an explanation. But before I could say anything, my father, seeing what was happening, intervened decisively. He took the microphone away from them and, with unprecedented severity for him, exclaimed, "Enough. Enough. Don't you realize that you're making a fool of yourself?" His words abruptly cut short their ridiculous demands, and there was a moment of tense silence. "My name is Sophia, I am 30 years old and I work in an office. I am currently dating a man named Tyler, who is 32 years old. He is only 2 years older than me. Our meeting took place thanks to my friend, who, worried about my loneliness, decided to introduce me to him. I always thought that I could cope with my life alone, that love and marriage were not for me. After all, my life was not easy. I lost my mother when I was very young, and since then my father has raised me alone. He always worked hard to give me nothing. Thanks to his care and efforts, I grew up safe and comfortable, but the loss of my mother left a deep wound in my heart. For a long time I could not cope with the pain of this loss, because my mother was everything to me. This early experience of loss taught me to be careful about my feelings, and therefore I tried not to let anyone get too close to me. Since high school, I've avoided serious relationships, and I was sure that I could live my life alone. When I first met Tyler, I didn't have any special feelings for him. He was kind and attentive, but I took his courtship for granted, without feeling romantic affection for him. However, Tyler turned out to be persistent, and although I wasn't ready for a relationship, he continued to ask me out, showing patience and care. Over time, I began to feel that I could trust him. Tyler was not just polite, he showed deep understanding, sincere participation in my experiences, and gradually I began to open up to him. Being with Tyler warmed my heart, his concern penetrated into the deepest corners of my soul, and feeling this tenderness, I realized that I had to respond in kind. He was the man who gave me back my faith and love, and I was determined to do as much for him as he did for me. When I finally told my father about our decision to get married, his reaction was unexpected. He was so overwhelmed with emotion that tears came to his eyes. "Wow, Sophia, you're finally getting married," he said, barely able to contain his excitement. "I'm so happy for you." In response, I tried to lighten the mood with a joke. "Oh, Dad, you're so dramatic." We laughed, but his next remark made me think. "You know," he said, "I've always worried that you'd never get married." Those words stung me. It turns out that my father, this strong and always restrained man, was worried about my future all this time, even if he never showed it. "Oh, really? I had no idea that you were so worried," I said in surprise, and he sighed and replied, "Well, every father worries about his daughter. It's just a part of life." His voice was full of sincerity, and I felt how deeply he cared about me. "Anyway, congratulations, honey," he added, smiling through tears, and I, feeling a surge of emotion, quietly replied, "Thanks, Dad." I was happy that he supported me at this important moment, because he had raised me alone since I was a child, and his approval meant more to me than I could put into words. I already foresaw how tears of joy would overwhelm me at our wedding, and I knew that my father would cry even more, because he could no longer contain his feelings even now. Meanwhile, the wedding preparations consumed all our time. Tyler and I were constantly busy at work, and every day was filled with endless chores. Our weekdays were hectic, and the weekends were completely devoted to planning and preparing for the celebration. We worked tirelessly, trying to take into account every detail, and our calendars became like a continuous chain of business and meetings. Rest seemed unattainable, and we decided to devote the only rare day off to a visit to Tyler's parents' house. It was an important event, because I was going to meet them for the first time. Tyler had already met my father shortly after he proposed to me. Then we agreed that we would visit his parents soon, but their busy schedules did not allow us to do this right away. Months passed waiting for the right moment, and finally the day came when we managed to arrange a meeting. We arrived at his parents' house, and despite Tyler's calm words, I suddenly felt excited. "Don't worry," he said, noticing my concern. "My parents are very kind people." His words were full of confidence and tenderness, and they calmed me down a little. I took a deep breath and, gathering my courage, rang the doorbell. His mother opened the door, and Tyler, with a smile on his face, said, "Mom, I'm home." In response, she greeted her son warmly and affectionately, "Welcome, Tyler. I'm so glad to see you." Her voice was full of tenderness, and I felt my tension ease for a moment. I gathered all my politeness and said with a smile, "Nice to meet you. My name is Sophia, I'm Tyler's fiancée." But as soon as her gaze fell on me, her face changed. The smile disappeared and her voice became colder. "Oh, it's you, Sophia," she said, looking me up and down with such a gaze and studying me that I felt awkward. Her attitude seemed to turn upside down in an instant. She stopped being the kind and friendly woman her son had just met. Instead, she invited us into the living room with cold politeness, but her detachment was obvious. "Sophia, I'm curious what you're going to bring to this family," his mother began with barely concealed displeasure in her voice. "Tyler is our treasure, our only child. If you're going to marry him, you have to be the right wife. Are you worthy of him?" Her words sounded more like an interrogation than an interest in my future and their family. I was stunned. This question took me by surprise, and I couldn't immediately find the words to answer. His mother's cold, detached attitude cut to the quick, and I felt the excitement overwhelm me with renewed vigor. "You're going to become part of our family, do you understand that? Are you ready for such a step?" She continued, not giving me a chance to recover from the first blow. Of course, I understood that marrying Tyler meant accepting his family, but why would it suddenly turn into some kind of initiation ritual, as if I were marrying not Tyler, but all of them combined? Their family was neither the Kennedy dynasty nor some famous aristocratic family to make such demands on me. I thought I was marrying the man I love, not the heir to the royal house. Where does this expectation of complete dedication and lifelong commitment come from? Besides, I wasn't even going to live with them. Our plan was simple. Tyler and I had to build our lives together, apart from his parents. I didn't like this pressure, this imposition of obligations. I was starting to feel resistance boiling up inside, but before I could gather my thoughts, Tyler's mother interrupted me again, this time with obvious annoyance. "When I ask you a question, I expect an immediate answer," she said sharply, and her voice became even more harsh. "Are you being rude? I'm asking if you're ready to be a part of our family." Her voice grew louder and louder, and although I felt overwhelmed by the pressure, I managed to answer quietly, "I hope that Tyler and I will support each other in our marriage." I tried to speak as gently and confidently as possible, but her reaction was instant and dismissive. "What nonsense," she snorted, "you won't just be supporting each other. Your main responsibility is to support Tyler. You are his wife, this is your job. Her words sounded like an accusation, and I began to doubt whether she even understood the essence of an equal relationship in marriage. You don't even understand the basics. She continued, not giving me a chance to explain or object. Finally, Tyler's father, who had been silent up to that point, decided to intervene. His voice was much softer, and he tried to defuse the situation. Darling, calm down, please. I'm sorry about that, Sophia. You must have been scared by my wife's words. His tone was peaceful, but I still felt the weight of tension hanging in the air. It's okay, I replied quietly, trying not to show my inner turmoil. He continued, you see, my wife is very protective of Tyler, he's our only son. Maybe she's just worried and doesn't fully realize what she's saying. I had barely breathed a sigh of relief when Tyler's brother came into the room. At first, his presence seemed calming to me. He was calm, his voice sounded soft and reasonable, and it seemed to me that he would be an ally in this difficult situation. Don't worry, Sophia, he said, smiling. My mother's words, though harsh, have a meaning. However, his next words plunged me into even more shock. Actually, what worries us the most is that you grew up in a single-parent family. What do you mean? I asked, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. He continued with the same deadpan smile. We can't be too happy that a person with your background will become the wife of our only son. Do you understand what I mean? These words sounded like a punch in the gut, and I couldn't keep silent anymore. Wait a minute, I said sharply, trying to collect my thoughts. What's wrong with being raised by one parent? My father worked very hard to give me everything I needed, and I am proud of him. He raised me to be a decent person. But my protest made no impression. His mother intervened again, as if my words didn't exist at all. Because you didn't have a mother, you couldn't learn how to be a good wife, how to run a household. I felt my anger rising, and I replied with restraint. I helped my father with household chores, and, moreover, I can cook. So please don't make conclusions about me based on what you don't know. I found that my relatives had completely taken over the conversation, leaving me with almost no opportunity to get a word in that evening. It made me think even more deeply about what this marriage means to me, and what difficulties might arise. I decided to share my doubts with Tyler. Tyler, I began carefully, choosing my words so as not to sound too harsh. Do your parents always talk to people like that? He looked at me with an expression of mild bewilderment, as if he did not understand the essence of my question. What do you mean? What is it? He asked, as if everything was in order. I was surprised at his calmness, because at that moment I expected at least the slightest understanding or sympathy. Well, I mean the way your parents talked to me, and what they said, I continued modestly, hoping that he would understand how painful those words were for me. Oh, really? They were just wondering if you were ready for this marriage, Tyler replied, still remaining impassive. My heart sank. He really didn't see any problem with that. Yes, I understand that they are worried about their son, but to be honest, the way they talk to me seems too much, tough, I added, trying to stay calm, even though everything was boiling inside. Tyler seemed somewhat taken aback by my words. What's wrong with that? They just expressed their opinion. Besides, they've already given us their blessing, so you don't have to worry about it, he said, his tone as even as before. I felt like a wall of misunderstanding had grown between us. It bothered me that Tyler seemed to be more protective of his parents than he was of me, his future wife. This made me uneasy, because I expected him to take my side, at least in this matter. Perhaps he sensed my confusion because he suddenly came over and hugged me. Sophia, you have nothing to worry about. My parents are just a little worried about their only son getting married. Everything will be fine, don't dwell on it, he said, but his words didn't sound comforting. It seemed that he did not fully understand or did not want to understand how deeply his parents had hurt me. They just want the best for us. They want us to be as good a couple as they are, so maybe we were a little harsh, he added, as if that was supposed to explain and settle everything. Really? I replied doubtfully, feeling that his words had not completely calmed me down. Maybe his parents really expected too much from us, but even if they did, they had no right to belittle me just because I was raised by one father. I kept saying, Tyler, I don't think people who think this is acceptable make a good couple. We are getting married, and our task is to build our own relationship, and not depend on their approval or disapproval. Tyler remained silent, and I decided not to dwell on his parents anymore. Although I still felt upset, I realized that continuing these thoughts could only complicate our relationship. So I decided to focus on what is really important, our love and the fact that we are together. The wedding day has arrived. It was a truly grandiose moment. Many guests filled the hall. Relatives, friends, colleagues, and even our bosses came to share this important day with us. I walked down the aisle, holding my father's arm, a man who devoted his life to my upbringing. At that moment, I realized that everything I had been through had brought me here, to this happiness. When Tyler and I exchanged vows and rings, the room was filled with applause. It was the moment when I really felt for the first time that I was marrying Tyler, that he would be my companion for life. A real happiness flared up in my heart, which I had never experienced before. Then we moved on to the reception, where we were greeted with applause and congratulations. The hall was full of joy and laughter. I hugged friends I hadn't seen for a long time, laughed and enjoyed every moment. Despite all my previous concerns about Tyler's parents, I was sincerely glad that I had taken this step, that I had decided to become his wife. When the final stage of our event arrived, Tyler and I, as well as both our families, lined up to greet all the guests. However, I noticed that Tyler's parents, especially his mother, looked a little strange. Their faces were bright red, and they were a little unsteady on their feet. My relatives were obviously drunk, but we had to continue the ceremony, despite the fact that the situation was already getting out of control. The host handed me the microphone, and then, all of a sudden, Tyler's mother snatched it out of my hands. She burst into screams that sounded more like the speeches of a wrestler in the ring than the words appropriate for a wedding evening. "Listen to me, Sophia," she began, her voice ringing over the crowd, drawing more and more attention to us. "After this wedding, you will belong completely to us. You are ready to dedicate yourself to us because we will test you for real." The guests around began to look at each other and whisper. Some even laughed, thinking that this could be a joke, an entertaining number. But I knew there was no humor in what Tyler's mother said. It was a real warning. I felt the blood rush to my face when Tyler's father grabbed the microphone and added, "Sophia, aren't you ashamed to wear a dress like that?" His voice sounded harsh, like a lash, and then Tyler's mother gladly supported, "Honey, you should have told her the truth." These were humiliating words, and I felt a lump of resentment stuck in my throat. The whispers among the guests changed, became colder and more intense. I turned to Tyler, hoping that he would intervene, that he would protect me from my own parents. But Tyler didn't seem to understand the gravity of the situation. His face remained impenetrable, as if nothing special was happening. "I can't do anything," he said softly, not looking me in the eye. "They didn't do anything wrong." At that moment, I realized that I would always be alone in front of his parents, that Tyler would never protect me from their cool remarks. This realization was like an icy wind, piercing to the bone. My relatives, not noticing the loss of my composure, continued to mock me. They said that despite our wedding, I had to prove that I was worthy of being a part of their family. "You have to prove that you have enough money to maintain our standard of living," they said. "After you register your marriage, you will be obliged to give us several $1,000s a month, as well as all your bonuses." I stood in a daze, not believing my ears. How could they say such a thing, and even at our wedding reception? My father finally couldn't stand it. He decisively snatched the microphone from them, his voice booming and confident. "Enough of this. You don't understand what you're doing, you're embarrassing yourself." His words echoed through the hall like thunder. Tyler's parents instantly turned their eyes on him, full of discontent and rage. "Why are you interrupting us when we're talking? We know that this woman's father was a bad example. Single parents were never good," they continued. My hands clenched into fists in outrage. I couldn't believe they dared to insult my father. The father, remaining surprisingly calm, looked them straight in the eye and replied, "You are even worse than I imagined. You even refuse to meet me because I'm a single father. And yet, despite this, I would never have thought that people like you work for President Scott." My father's words hit them like a hammer. Tyler's father's face turned as gray as a stone. "How do you know President Scott? What is it?" he asked with belated curiosity, trying to keep his voice calm. "President Scott is a business partner of my company and, more importantly, an old friend of mine," my father calmly explained. "And speaking of single parents, I want to remind you that President Scott was also raised by one mother. So you just insulted the head of the company you work for." Tyler's parents' faces immediately changed, their self-confidence melting before their eyes like snow under a hot sun. They clearly realized the depth of their mistake. "I'm sorry, sir. Please don't tell the president about this," Tyler's father muttered humbly, suddenly kneeling down. In the blink of an eye, he turned from an arrogant and domineering man into a defeated one, begging for forgiveness. From behind, I heard the restrained laughter of the guests. Some of them even started to take out their phones to record this humiliating scene. My father, remaining cool, quietly said, "No matter how much you apologize, you can't take back your words." He turned to me, and I saw support in his eyes, for which I was ready to thank him endlessly. "Sophia," he said softly, holding out his hand to me, "do you want to come home with me?" I resolutely took the microphone out of Tyler's hands and, gathering all my dignity, said, "Thank you for the wonderful entertainment, but there will be no wedding." My voice sounded firm, and there was a tense silence in the hall. All eyes turned to me, to Tyler, to his parents, as if the guests couldn't believe their ears. My gaze crossed with Tyler's. There was confusion in his eyes, but no sign of protest or attempt to intervene. I no longer expected his support, knowing that from now on I would build my own future. "I will definitely refund all the money you gave us for this occasion," I continued, no longer hesitating. Tyler and his parents seemed to be petrified as the guests began to whisper, their expressions reflecting genuine bewilderment. But I didn't hesitate. Taking my father's arm, I left the hall, feeling the tension that had been holding me down all day gradually dissipate, giving way to a strange relief. In passing, I noticed how Tyler's relatives rushed to me with worried faces, clearly trying to fix something. Chaos broke out in the hall, the noise of voices grew like a storm. But it didn't bother me anymore. I felt calm and confident that I was doing the right thing. When I returned the money to them, my apologies to the guests were met with respect and sympathy. Some approached me personally, praising me and my father for our courage and firmness. "It's good that you didn't let such people take advantage of you," several guests told me. These words supported me, strengthened me in my decision. Tyler's colleagues who attended the reception probably did not miss the chance to talk about what happened in his company. The responses were disappointing. Tyler began to be criticized for his weakness of character, for his inability to stand up for himself and his fiancée in front of his parents. His reputation was ruined. I heard that he resigned shortly after, unable to cope with the humiliation that befell him. But, as it turned out, this was just the beginning. The president of the company where Tyler's father worked also found out about the incident. The same man my former in-laws insulted without even knowing his story. Tyler's father was demoted and sent to a small, remote division of the company, far outside the city, in the countryside. It was a real disaster for his career, which he always spoke so proudly about. Tyler's relatives, upon hearing about the scandal, also turned away from his family. For them, they became a source of shame, and people whom they once considered their friends gradually began to turn away from them. I couldn't help but think that this whole situation was entirely their own fault. Sometimes fate punishes people for their arrogance and greed, and this time the consequences of their actions were devastating. But I was no longer involved in this family hell. Fate has freed me from the mistakes that I could have made by associating my life with such an environment. Meanwhile, I turned my attention to completely different priorities. Realizing how important my father's support and love were to me, I began to spend much more time with him. Our relationship grew stronger day by day, and one day, during one of our conversations, my father asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Sophia, have you ever thought about taking over my company?" "What is it?" he asked, his voice full of hope and pride. "You mean, become the president of your company?" I asked uncertainly, feeling excitement mixed with surprise. My father nodded, and I saw confidence in his eyes that I could handle it. It was an offer I had never thought of, but at the same time, the realization of this chance gave me a new sense of purpose. "I will do my best," I promised him, feeling my desire grow not only to meet his expectations, but also to exceed them. From that moment on, I decided to devote myself to my career. I no longer wanted to be dependent on other people's opinions or seek happiness in a romantic relationship. My future was now connected with work, with responsibility, and the opportunity to prove to myself that I could achieve anything I wanted. I delved into studying everything that could help me achieve success in my father's company, plunging into work with renewed vigor. Remembering everything that happened at that ill-fated wedding, I realized that Tyler's parents had acted unwisely, turning what should have been a wonderful start to a new life into a shameful spectacle. But, fortunately, the official registration of the marriage did not take place, and now I was free from all these unsolvable problems with future fathers-in-law.